So the webinar today is planning and implementing fuel treatment activities in BC's diverse ecosystems. And it's brought to you by a number of actors, including the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative, which assists local governments, First Nations, and industries in integrating climate change adaptation into their planning and decision making. And we also have an online portal for adaptation resources if you're interested at retooling.ca. In addition to BC RAC, the individuals and organizations bringing this to you today are our two webinar presenters, of course, as well as the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, Natural Resources Canada, the Association of BC Forest Professionals, and the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. Oh, and my name is Kate Murphy, and I'm from the Fraser Basin Council, and I also have my colleague Elena Chia with me on the webinar today. Just a couple things about retooling.ca that you might be interested in. If you'd like to get updates on adaptation-related resources, news, and funding opportunities, definitely sign up for our newsletter. And we post all of our webinars, so this one will also be posted online, so they will be accessible afterwards, and we will also be sending an update to everybody who registered with the data on this webinar with the upload. Just a quick note about Adaptation Canada 2020. It will be hosted from February 19th to 21st in Vancouver. And if you're interested in getting up-to-date information on that, including when registration opens, you can sign up for email updates at bit.ly/adapt2020. And a couple of housekeeping items. Please keep your audio muted. If you have any questions, you can enter those into the question box. You can see them in the control panel that's got an image on your screen there. And if you'd like to ask a question verbally, feel free to put that in the question box as well, and we can unmute you. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can email fraserbasin@gmail.com or put those technical difficulties into the question box, and Elena can help you out with that. So today's wonderful speakers are Kelly Osbourne and Rory Caldwell. And Kelly is a RPF who has worked across BC from Haida Gwaii to Fernie and is now in Victoria, BC. Kelly graduated from UBC with a degree in forest management and has been working for the BC Wildfire Service for 7 years. Kelly is the Fire and Fuel Management Officer for the province of BC and provides professional expertise on the development and implementation of fire and fuel management legislation, policy, and funding programs. Thank you, Kelly, for being here today. And Rory Caldwell, RFT, is the Superintendent of Fuels Management and a fire behavior specialist working for the BC Wildfire Service in Williams Lake since 2008. Over the past decade, Rory has developed an extensive background in forest fuel management, including prescribed fire. Rory's forestry career also includes silviculture and harvesting positions with BCTS in 100 Mile House, with the Ministry of Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development in Merritt, and also as a forest consultant. Thank you both so much for being here today, and we will just pass it over to you and get started.
Good morning. Oh, go ahead, Rory.
I just want to make sure that we're up and live.
It looks great.
I can see, yes. Yeah,
Good.
Absolutely. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our presentation. Rory and I are very happy and excited to be here and share some of our knowledge and understanding of fire and fuel management in BC, looking across some of our ecosystems and our communities. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to present today. Next. So we're going to talk today about a little bit higher level strategic introduction on wildfire risk reduction in BC, talk a little bit about what that means for fuel management goals and principles, drive that down to sort of planning and prescribing fuel management treatments, and then spend a fair amount of time today on sort of fire behavior principles and concepts and applying those to specifying fuel management treatment targets, incorporating prescribed fire into treatment design, and then applying those principles to some specific ecosystems in British Columbia, and then have some time for questions. So next. Oh, we had another poll question, but we'll just start with one of the Outcomes of this webinar that we're hoping is obviously there'll be a variety of attendees from forest and field management practitioners to local authorities, Indigenous government representations, and potentially everything in between. So the outcome from our perspective is to initiate and broaden knowledge of key science-based, including fire behavior fundamentals, to develop principles and apply when planning and implementing field treatments in British Columbia. So I think Kate, oh, there we are. So we just wanted to get a sense before we dive into the details on the cross pollination or levels of involvement in field management prior to your attendance on the call today.
So Kelly, I don't know that presenters can actually see the results, so I'll just give a quick verbal overview. It looks like a lot of people are coming at this with an introductory level of knowledge, about 32% of people. 25% have an intermediate level, 18% have an advanced level, and extensive as well as nil level is at about 13% both.
Great. I think that's most likely the type of audience that we designed this webinar for. So sort of hitting that introductory to occasional versus extensive expertise. So that's positive, and we'll dive right in. Next, please. So one of the concepts we just wanted to put up at the front, working from the Association of BC Forest Professionals document from 2013, it is, practicing in the field of fire and fuels management requires a specific type of education and training in subjects such as, but not limited to, fire ecology, fire effects, fire behavior, fire regimes, condition classes, fuel types, fuel moisture content, fire suppression, prescribed burning, fire behavior modeling, and fire weather, in addition to our fundamental forestry concepts. So we just wanted to kind of spend a bit of time on that. Obviously, this presentation is meant to start a broader conversation. It's certainly not meant to fill the gap of all of those different educational or knowledge baselines to be an effective practitioner in field management. And as we said, forest professionals play a key role in field management in British Columbia, such as the development of field management prescriptions. And as we said, accredited by the Association of BC Forest Professionals, who possess a sound understanding of both fire behavior and resource management, will be invaluable in planning for and achieving field management objectives in British Columbia. So next. We're just going to talk a little bit at a high level before I turn it over to Rory to sort of get into some of the fundamentals. But as a result of the Abbott-Chapman report, there was direction for the province to take a look at a more structured, risk-based approach to wildfire management across British Columbia. And that applies as well to the design and planning and implementation of fuel management as a fundamental tool for risk reduction. So the BC government has adopted the CSA ISO 31000 as a standard. It describes a very structured and disciplined process for risk management. It helps to guide the efforts undertaken to both identify and mitigate that risk and to reduce the uncertainty in the achievement of goals and objectives. This is really important for field management and being able to apply a structured, a science-based, fire behavior-based focus on how we design and develop fuel management in concert with other risk management activities across the landscape and for the primary objective of reducing risk to communities across BC. So next. So a risk-based framework consists of the consideration of likelihood of an unwanted wildfire event and the consequences to values as a measure of risk. Likelihood is the probability of the event occurring, consequence is the amount of damage occurring as a result. So when we're thinking about our fuel management at the stand level is to always remember and build in these particular concepts. So it's measured as the product of the two. Multiple inputs are required in order to effectively quantify that risk. That includes likelihood, severity, the value type, and the vulnerability of that value. And that risk can be measured at multiple scales from a provincial level all the way down to a stand level decision and planning opportunity. And as also through the identification of risk level, and this is fundamental, those priorities for mitigation, as well as preparation for untoward events, are both enhanced. And as I mentioned, fuel management is a fundamental tool, but there's also other tools in the toolbox when it comes to mitigation opportunities. And specific to BC, because of our highly diverse ecosystems, topography, fire regime history, fire weather, and the way that our communities are designed and laid out across the landscape, differing risk levels require tailored risk management to minimize negative impacts to communities and our high value resources and assets. So across British Columbia, very different approaches need to be considered when it comes to fuel management or risk reduction decisions that reflect that high variability across British Columbia. Next. So these are just the fundamental concepts. I won't spend too much time on this. Obviously, establishing the context, identify those risks, analyze them, evaluate them, and treat them. So again, in the concept of fuel management or risk reduction to communities, we want to be able to apply all of those thoughts and consideration, as well as monitoring and review and improvement as we move forward in British Columbia. There's certainly an opportunity based on I think it's 13 or 14 years since the Filman Report and the Strategic Wildfire Prevention Initiative was initiated, to take some of that learning, that monitor and review opportunities, and apply more recent science as well as learnings from across North America when it comes to wildfire impacts on communities, and reestablish that context and move British Columbia forward. Next. So in BC, risk-based planning can occur at multiple scales. As I mentioned, when it comes to fuel management, we would be looking at a higher level landscape analysis or a community wildfire protection plan scale to take a look at that modeling or identifying the likelihood and the consequence to those values as a land manager or a local authority level. The outcome of that is a map or prioritized operational areas for specific planning, tactics, or treatment areas to eventually reduce that risk. At the operational unit analysis, again, we're looking at planning strategies and tactics for operational areas. This includes communities, could be multiple communities, could be multiple scales, landscape unit down to a road corridor, and it's based on that initial level of identification of risk. And then the solutions could include things such as landscape field breaks with a specific objective to reduce risk to a community, treatments inside the wildland-urban interface, which could include both FireSmart and fuel management treatments. And obviously the outcome is a reduction in risk. And then we have the site-specific analysis, including prescriptions, FireSmart hazard assessments. And the outcome is site-specific actions leading to treatment implementation. So next. So I won't spend too much time on this. BC has at a very high level, at a provincial scale, undertaken, and we're currently undertaking a 2019 version of the Provincial Strategic Threat Analysis. So it is an initial high level approach to looking at the key fire behavior inputs and fuel type inputs across BC to start to provide some clarity on that uncertainty when it comes to wildfire risks. There's provincial maps and linkages, and they'll be available in the PDF as follow-up linkages for folks that are more interested. It is at a provincial level. It is based on the inventory. So obviously it's one part of a strategic risk assessment, but it does start to prioritize I think it's 97 million hectares of forest and grasslands, and I think 6 million hectares of interface areas across British Columbia, of which 3 million hectares are private land. So we have some large numbers in British Columbia. And so we're trying to drive that down to from a provincial level to potentially regional level risk analysis, and then down to that community wildfire protection plan or site level. Next. Oh, next, Roy. Oh, there we go. So this is just a couple of snapshots. Again, this is a 2017 version, and it does not have the 17 or 18 wildfire perimeters on it. But it is an example of starting to drill down to a potentially a regional area and looking at the spatial patterns across the land base or the landscape when it comes to identifying where we might want to prioritize and start to design our field treatment opportunities with that fundamental objective of reducing risk to communities. As we start to look at the interface across British Columbia, irrespective of jurisdictional boundaries, you start to see a lot more patterns of consistency or higher density that is continuous than was historically across British Columbia. So our wildland urban interface is expanding, most likely faster than we are treating it at the moment as a consequence of folks coming from across British or Canada, or moving to the interior areas from Vancouver or the larger cities. So we're mapping that about every two or 3 years, trying to get the best data we have. But that certainly is being reflective, I think, in some of the levels of evacuation orders and alerts that we're seeing in the past couple of years. So it's really important when we get into designing those field treatments and those concepts and the prioritizations to be able to understand the scope and the scale of some of the interface challenges that we have in British Columbia. So just next, Rory, just whip through these pretty quick. So when we remove the threats outside of the interface, you can start to see the patterns. These areas are a little bit denser than the traditional 6 structures per square kilometer. That is our base wildland urban interface in British Columbia. These are looking at just highlighting the greater than 25. So as we move forward, we don't need to have specific lines in the sand of where an interface starts or where we might want to place a field treatment, but we certainly want to be able to highlight the primary objective would still be to reduce the negative impacts on these communities in these areas across British Columbia. Next. As we start to zoom in, we start to get to that more community level of planning, tactical or operational field treatment level of planning, and we start to look at not just the structures that define our interface in British Columbia, but also the critical infrastructure that resides either within our interface or isolated around it. And this particular map of Williams Lake shows that we have some interface areas on the top western corner, a couple of those icons, as well as adjacent to the 2017 fire perimeters. So we're starting to bring together those multiple pieces of information to help us determine, as we move forward in British Columbia, what is the fuel management, or how do we want to design and implement those specific treatments. And we spend a lot of time looking at maps, and I think it's really important that we remember at the end of the day, who the primary client or who's going to be using these particular fuel breaks when these particular fires start to impact communities. So if you just look at the star that's in the center of the map here, and Rory will flip to the next slide. So the primary user of fuel breaks in British Columbia is going to be the BC Wildfire Service staff. It will be the incident commanders. It will be the folks that are charged with, just as this picture suggests, this is from 2017, getting up in the airplane and making decisions about what to do when these sorts of scenarios occur. So it's really important as we start to design these fuel treatments that we're cognizant and we're linking in and working closely with some of the BC Wildfire Service staff to be able to provide them with the best fuel break opportunity to achieve their suppression objectives and response and incident tactical planning objectives. So I just wanted to bring that up. So next. I'm just going to go through these quickly because I want to turn this over to Rory. So this is another example of, I showed you the caribou. Obviously, we switched to the northeast. Very different diversity in the southeast, between the dry ecosystems of the trench as you get into the ICH and the transitional areas. Very different fuel management objectives and very different potential opportunities for FireSmart. Within there, we have topographical influences. All of those different factors come into play when we're trying to determine what's the best solution. The other interesting point here, once again, is to show the consistency of the interface area. It's not just Caslow and then there's no places of folks living to Nelson. There is a consistent density within these areas, and that presents significant challenges both for response as well as applying relatively limited resourcing in the most efficient factor to be able to mitigate risk to these communities. So next. So again, I'm just going to spend 2 seconds on this. Is just a snapshot that highlights that interface. As you look to the west there, obviously the Burn and Okanagan is one, I think it's 200,000 hectare interface dense area. So again, just highlighting that point to the scope of the interface in British Columbia. So next. And again, this is just zooming in. So one of the new shifts in British Columbia when it comes to wildfire risk reduction is looking at that provincially important infrastructure. So looking at where's the infrastructure that's going to be able to maintain the province's ability to respond to the event, as well as reduce the potential of a wildfire event becoming a catastrophic event with respect to infrastructure. So as we move forward, we're starting to analyze not just the interface itself, but looking at defining and mitigating opportunities on the infrastructure interface. So going ahead. When we bring that all together, essentially we do have some goals in British Columbia for planning and prescribing fuel management. Our goals are, or we look at our goals from two different perspectives. There's obviously a human life and safety perspective. And the fundamental objective of all of our fuel treatments around the interface within British Columbia is reducing fire behavior so it is safer and easier for firefighters to suppress wildfire. Once that occurs, that will mitigate the negative impacts to the wildland-urban interface and our infrastructure interface. In addition to that, we want to focus on creating FireSmart communities and infrastructure located within the wildland-urban interface to reduce the structure ignitability and to minimize catastrophic impacts from wildfire events. From a resiliency perspective, reducing fire severity, so it's likely that areas of forest will survive, soil damage will be limited, and post-fire restoration activities will be minimized, and restoring the natural cycle of fire-maintained grasslands. Next. So firefighter safety, I just wanted to spend an additional moment on this. Our staff are always put into situations where their objective is to try and control that fire behavior. And as you can see here, that it's challenging on its own. So once again, it's really fundamental as we're designing these field treatments, especially around our communities, to think about the firefighter safety as one of those fundamental objectives, as well as suppression success. That's going to really be able to give our incident commanders and our folks the best chance. So I just wanted to put a quick slide in about FireSmart. As we move forward in British Columbia, it's really important that when we're looking at fuel management, we actually look at FireSmart and fuel management at the same time. So how do we link those two principles together? That's really going to give our communities the most success and the most resiliency as we move forward. So it is clear that FireSmart does work. The findings of the Horse River wildfire show that even under extreme fire behavior conditions, homes that were FireSmart had survived and homes that weren't did not. So it is really important, and as we move forward, we want to be able to think about those things together, not in isolation. Next. A couple of key principles. Obviously, fuel management prescribes specific measurable targets for fire behavior reduction. Rory's going to spend some time on that. Prescription describes the recommended fuel management activities with measurable fire behavior outcomes. We want to see specific measurable fuel targets are described so that we can actually start to measure those outcomes. We want a cost-effective and measurable reduction in expected fire behavior with a consideration, obviously, of other values on the landscape. And we need to consider the balance between potential fire behavior implications and resource values. Next. Okay, obviously we need to be aligning other legal, non-statutory, and resource management objectives. This is just a quick example of looking at our value objectives as well as some of our resource management objectives. In different ecosystems, we have different wildlife that we manage for, and we still want to be able to, while we're thinking about the fire behavior reduction, especially next to those homes, be as efficient and effective in achieving that balance as possible. Next. So our prescription considers the unique variability that exists in each of our stands. I talked a little bit about that. Obviously, we have very different vertical strata, horizontal fuel continuity, extent of surrounding fuel, fire weather components, topography, etc. And our treatments need to be appropriate for the given biogeoclimatic area and also consider some fire weather factors such as rate of decay for slash, controlling canopy density, and retaining suitable species. Next. Treatment targets obviously utilize a zoned approach, generally within 2 kilometers of the value. We want to see fuels treated more intensively closest to the value. And our design maximizes opportunities to anchor to non-fuel or low flammability areas, such as water bodies, wetlands, and roads. Next. Scale matters. I have this on the front of the slide as well, but I think this is a really powerful visualization as you can start to see the actual change in fire behavior as it intersected with this field treatment, obviously impacting the trees on the edge and then bringing that fire down to the ground. So Rory's going to talk a bit more about those components. So next. Oh, next. Oh, there we go. Rory.
Yeah, it took a little bit there, sorry. So yeah, Kelly's kind of gone over the where to place field treatments and what tools are available to help in those determinations. So those WUI risk class maps and the PSTA, and this is just an example of a tactical plan in the Williams Lake area. And I think one of the important things is to have some ability to adapt. You know, we had some fires in 2017 that are going to change a little bit of how we maybe approach this. But you can see just some of the line work in there. There are some kind of strategic fuel breaks along the outskirts, and then a bunch of colored lines in and around communities in the interface there. Just a bit of an idea on what a tactical plan could look like when we apply those concepts. When we go through kind of some of these concepts of effective WUI fuel treatments, you know, in a lot of cases, and you can see it on the map here, they're linear. They don't have to be. Polygons might be suitable in some cases. And as we move through the rest of the presentation, we are going to put some focus and some emphasis kind of mostly on some mechanical and hand treatments that might include prescribed fire that are, you know, just intended to reduce wildfire risk to the communities.
Great, and Roy, just skip 2 slides. Okay, perfect. We do have some tools that we're working on to help support practitioners. We have a new field management prescription guidance document. These links will all be available for folks. So I'm just going to kind of whip through this. Roy's going to get into more detail of the concepts in the field management prescription guidance document. So go ahead. You can skip over that one. We'll just go straight to the data collection, Rory. I think there we go. So one of the concepts as we move forward in British Columbia is we do want to see information, data collection consistent with the concepts of in the Silviculture Surveys Procedures Manual, especially if you're doing multi-stand, multi-story, partial cutting. There's certainly some guidance in those documents as well as the surface field component. So on our Tools for website, we're starting to, some of these documents are a bit older, but there is some document out there about how to provide, how to develop statistically defensible procedures for inventorying that woody material on the ground. So as Roy gets into the details on some of the modeling and also getting information into results in a way that's going to update our inventory, we do need to be thinking about data collection. Next.
Okay, so I think this is where we want to throw out another poll question, just in and around people's kind of fire behavior, your background, just to gauge kind of where we're at. So as folks are doing that, I'm just going to kind of introduce some of this fire behavior piece a little bit. You know, frequently we get asked by prescribing foresters and other folks, what should the inter-tree distance be in a fuel treatment? What should the basal area be? What should the density be? And I understand why we get asked those questions. Having worked in silviculture, I know we want to grow quality trees. You know, there's a bit of a focus on timber production, and some of those other resources are managed by those metrics. From a fire behavior perspective, though, it's a bit different in that the density that you plant is not necessarily the density that you want when the stand is 20 or 30 years old. And that's, again, not necessarily the density you want again at 80 years. So it's why we've kind of shifted gears over the last little bit and kind of looking more at a fire behavior outcomes approach, which we're going to go through a little bit today.
So Rory, I just closed the poll, and introductory and intermediate are the 2 major ones, similar to the previous poll.
Perfect, thanks, Kate. Yeah, hopefully I'll be able to do some justice to the folks that are in the A category as we move through it, and hopefully we'll be able to move at a pace for the rest of everybody else to kind of get a bit of an understanding of what we're looking at with the fire behavior aspect of things. You know, Kate mentioned that I've been involved with fuel management for a little over 10 years now. Definitely didn't know the answers then. You know, working with a lot of different folks over that time frame, we've learned as we've gone along. Still don't have all the answers. You know, like Kelly said, we do want to share some of the learnings and the tools to assist folks that are, again, at that kind of intro level to be able to help do this kind of work. So it's important to specify that fuel breaks and treatments aren't going to stop an active wildfire. Kelly mentioned there are areas that are ideally anchored into an existing feature that are designed to alter and reduce fire behavior to allow for a suppression opportunity. And that could be direct attack, it could be air support, it could be an ignition operation, or it could be a combination of all those things. They should be designed based on the best available fire and forestry science to be effective under 90th percentile fire weather indices. And what I mean by that is the indices, and I'll explain that in a little bit in a minute, that are for the representative weather station over a time frame, generally more than 10 years of data, you know, for that June to August type of a season. So as we move through the rest of this, I am going to spend some time on each of those lower bullets. So fuel treatments are designed to alter fire behavior. You know, we want to reduce fire intensity, so we'll spend some time on that. Transitioning crown fire to surface fire, rate of spread, spotting potential, so looking at ember production within the fuel treatment and the receptibility of it as well, and then the probability of crown fire initiation. And we'll go through each one of those. So for those that don't come into this with a lot of fire behavior background, this is an image of the fire behavior triangle. So fire behavior really just refers to the manner in which fuel ignites, flame develops, fire spreads, and other related phenomena in relation to fuels, weather, and topography. So those three sides of the triangle. Fuel is the only one that we have the ability to affect. So that's why we're spending some time on discussing how we're going to affect that fuel. So with the fire weather index, you can see that it is a component of the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System. Across the top, we have 3 moisture codes that are all affected by weather elements. And as we moved from left to right, the fine fuel moisture code is those fine fuels, needles, twigs that are fairly reactive to weather changes. As we move across to the duff moisture code, we're getting down to those duff fuels. Some of the medium-sized woody material can be represented by the DMC. And then the drought code, or the DC, is kind of those deeper layers or bigger woody material. These all input into the 3 indexes that we can see below that. So the ministry weather stations take daily weather readings to update those moisture codes, which informs those indices or indexes that you can see below for that representative area. So the initial spread index, or the ISI, it's a combination of the FFMC and the wind, and it influences the spread rate. Whereas the buildup index, or the BUI, it provides an indication of what the available fuel is. Now, if you combine those together, you can get some outputs. So you get the fire weather index, which is kind of a generic rating of fire intensity. But the ISI and the BUI will provide some specific fire behavior outputs. So it can give us the rate of spread, the fire intensity, the type of fire, so a surface, an intermittent crown, or a continuous crown fire, the crown fraction burned, and some fuel consumption information for the fire behavior prediction system fuel types. So these again are those indices that we're referring to when we're looking at those 90th percentile conditions over a specified time frame for a weather station. So this chart is adapted from work of Alexander and de Groot. It's based on fire behavior observation in jack pine stands related to the FWI system. Fire intensity is one of the better metrics that we can use to develop targets. It's something that we can visualize by flame length, and we can also calculate it. And we'll show how to do that a little bit later here. So with the slide itself, you can see that on the left-hand side, we've got the intensity classes 1 through 6 and the corresponding intensity. And this is just a measure of energy output in kilowatts per meter. So that energy over an area. If we look at the chart on the right-hand side, we've got the same classes and we've got the same ranges in those first 2 columns. But in the next 2, we've got a corresponding flame length and flame height, just to give a bit of that visual representation. And then we've got a bit more of a descriptor of what that type of fire looks like in those intensity classes and what the suppression implications can be. So a particular note is once we start to exceed 2,000 kilowatts per meter or moving into that intensity class 4, you can see we're getting some fairly vigorous fire behavior, and our control efforts are now being challenged. And as we move into intensity class again, you can see that we're amping up again and has some implications on suppression. And then intensity class 6 isn't even really included on that chart on the right-hand side. And I think part of the reason, or good reason, is that once we start to get into intensity class 6, we're really not going to be that effective with suppression. We're looking at some really significant fire behavior. So knowing that, setting a fire behavior target or targets that are going to give suppression resources the best chance for success is absolutely paramount in the WUI. Our fuel treatments should be designed keeping in mind that it's not always necessarily the BC Wildfire Service that is responding. In a lot of cases, because we're working in these interface areas, it could be a volunteer fire department as well. So when I think back to those bullets that we looked at for fire behavior outcomes, the first one that I had was intensity. And what we're looking at for a target for a minimum of 100 meters closest to the value, and the value could be the community, structures, critical infrastructure, we want to see less than 2,000 kilowatts per meter. And that corresponds to that chart that we just looked at. You can see once we get beyond that, we are starting to get challenged for suppression. Kelly mentioned we can use a zoned approach when we're designing treatment. We can vary from this target as we move farther from the value to a point anyways, but we still need to consider the resulting anticipated fire behavior of the treatment that we're doing. So critical surface intensity is basically the intensity threshold for a forest stand based on its characteristics, which would be the foliar moisture content of the trees itself and the crown base height. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, in relation to what your actual surface fire intensity is that you have on site. And that will dictate whether or not we're going to initiate or start to see crown fire. So you can see the photo here gives you a bit of an idea of what 1,500 kilowatts per meter would look like. And you get a corresponding flame length there as well. So the other thing we want to look at is the reduction or transition of crown to surface fire. There's generally a common misconception that most wildfires are these raging independent crown fires. While it's possible with the right combination of stand and weather conditions, it's often not all that common. I've seen it with red attack pine beetle with wind or low relative humidity. But in the absence of some slope or those lower humidities and or wind or an absence of density, fire will drop to the surface. And generally speaking, crown fires are connected to the forest floor by fire in the surface and ladder fuels. So having a bit of a gap as we move into a fuel treatment to help with that reduction is obviously going to be beneficial. In many cases, approximately a tree length can be sufficient to start that transition from crown to surface. When you look at this photo, we've got about a 25-meter gap. It's associated with the haul road. You can still probably anticipate a bit of crown scorching and torching on the trees as the fire moves from, in this case, it would be the top of the slide to the bottom. As it moves across into that gap, you can still expect a little bit of scorching. So this is about 100 meters wide. It's pretty common for an approach that we use in the WUI. It can generally provide enough space if it's designed correctly for fire behavior to change, and it allows for that suppression opportunity. But we do need to account for the topography and the adjacent fuels and vary the width accordingly. So this one, this photo was taken, this was still under construction in 2017. It was done entirely mechanically. But yeah, you can see there's some disturbance, the haul road at the top of the slide, and then moving into the treated area. Here's another demonstration of just that gap. If we're standing on the untreated, looking towards the gap, and the treated stand in the background, and the value is on the other side of that coniferous forest. So this took advantage of an existing opening that did have some aspen and willow, which are species that are what we're promoting when we want to have fuel treatments. The fire behavior in them is generally a lot more minimal, that we can have suppression opportunities. So this was mechanical, harvested in 2010 with a hand treatment. And I would say in the last year or so, it's now something that we would maybe look at for an underburn or maintenance treatment, just to keep the integrity of it. Another example of just demonstrating that crown separation from untreated to treated to allow for that fire to transfer from the crown to the surface. In this case, we need to factor in some other variables that were part of it. And I know this particular photo was taken on the Hanceville fire in 2017. It was a little bit past the peak of the burning period, which I think had a bit of an influence as well. Fire behavior was starting to decrease a little bit into the evening, but the treatment itself, which wasn't a WUI fuel treatment, was more of a logging and thinning operation, still was fairly effective. You can note there's some bole scorching. These larger diameter fir trees have thick bark to withstand some moderate intensity surface fire, but you can see that some of the regen in this photo didn't survive. A couple of them did. And then there's some evidence you can see of some increased intensity where surface fuels were consumed, because it wasn't necessarily a WUI fuel treatment. So this would be, I would say, an adequate resiliency type of treatment, but without the surface fuel reduction that occurred over the fire, probably not an effective WUI fuel treatment. So rate of spread is another fire behavior outcome. When we alter the stand, we need to consider the potential impact on the rate of spread, and what the suppression implications are going to be. How many resources are we going to be required to help suppress that fire? So in this case, I just want to run through a bit of a scenario. So you can see at the top of the screen, we've got a fine fuel moisture code of 92. We've got a wind of approximately 12 kilometers per hour. And when we combine those two, we get an initial spread index, or an ISI, of about 10. And in this case, we're going to use a buildup index of 100, just again, looking at just kind of the time of year and the season. So granted, one of the benchmark fuel types isn't always an ideal fit or representation of an altered stand, but it's available science that gives us a pretty good approximation of potential fire behavior. So running those scenarios through with these kind of conditions here, and if I look at a C7 fuel type of the FBP system, for this stand on the left here, it produces an output of about 3.3 meters per minute of rate of spread and obviously a surface fire. And if I look at this treatment on the right-hand side using a grass fuel, standing grass fuel type with 55% cured. So what this is saying, this photo was taken fairly recently. For this time of year, it's saying that about 45% of it is still fairly green and holding moisture and won't burn very well. So the other rest of it, 55%, is fairly cured. So running it through, I get about 4.5 meters per minute, again, a surface fire. Now, if we take that same area and look at it again in another month and a half or so, depending on how much moisture we get as it starts to dry and cure, when we see it maybe move up to about 85% cure, you can see that our spread rate becomes fairly significant. When I look at intensities for both of these scenarios, I've looked at the C7, and the C7 as it in the FBP system, we'd be approaching about 3,000 kilowatts per meter. But based on the treatment that we've done in this stand and removing a lot of the fine surface fuels, it's probably getting closer to about around that 2,000 kilowatts per meter threshold that I spoke to earlier. The one on the right in the 55% cure scenario, because not all of the fuel is burning all that intensely, is we're looking at about 700 kilowatts per meter. And if we move into the 85%, we're up and over 3,000 based on the fuel loading. And what's in there that you can't see is a bit of those fine fuels from the harvesting operation that would contribute to that intensity. So with both of these treatments, we do need to consider maintenance. The forested stand is on a kind of southwest aspect. It was hand treated in about 2012 or 13, and it's at that point now where I think we could look at a maintenance treatment. Ideally, it'd be an underburn situation. The open area was harvested private land. It is in the interface. It was harvested in 2016. And you can see based on the productivity of it, it could already use some maintenance. Prescribed fire is an option, but I think we need to understand that the clumps that are out there, those standing trees, are gonna be subject to collateral damage through fire, and would be with a wildfire as well. So spotting potential. And I'm thinking on this slide specifically just about ember sources or firebrand sources. So research, and some of it that I've read is out of Oregon State University, and observation shows that fine fuels, those twigs, those small branches, cones, pieces of bark, are the biggest producers of firebrands. And this is enhanced when continuous accumulated distribution of it allows for improved convective, so lift of that material. So in this case, you can see we've got some accumulations here, and then obviously in the debris pile that's being burned, it just helps to that contribution of ember source. So reducing these sources is a top treatment priority. The left is an actual in-stand photo of that fuel break that I showed under construction that was mechanically done in 2017. A minor amount of handwork has been done since, and that area is scheduled for underburning either this fall or next spring, just to reduce those fine fuels. And you can see what the surface fuel load is there for those pieces, less than that 7.1 centimeters in diameter. So we're looking at about 15 tons per hectare, which also equates to 1.5 kilograms per square meter. So when we're thinking of spotting potential, those same fine fuels that contribute to firebrand production are pretty much a double-edged sword. They're also those ember receptors. If we've got something coming in from outside of a treatment, that can increase that probability of sustained ignition. So that forested stand on the left-hand side was hand treated in, I believe it was 2007. It's a very clean forest floor in terms of fine woody material. There's some moss there, some herbaceous, a bit of grass. Probably could have done a little bit better or some higher pruning in that stand, but the forest floor is quite clean. The photos, so the one on the left, again, after about 12 years, it's maybe just starting to look at an opportunity now for maintenance treatment. And again, we're looking at prescribed fire. The photos on the right show areas that would be likely more receptive to spotting. So the top area would be seasonally susceptible to spotting. As it starts to cure, it just becomes that more potential for ignition. And then at the bottom, it's the same photo from that previous slide, that area that we're planning on doing an underburn in. So the other aspect I want to talk about is crown fire initiation. So we already had a bit of discussion about fires being connected to the surface. This is just some further demonstration of that. So if you can envision a fire on that area on the left-hand side there, basically what it's saying is if you have a fire that has enough of intensity that it can breach this crown base height, this gap, based on the foliar moisture content and how high that gap is, it will initiate crown fire. So that's our critical surface intensity. There's a threshold there where we'll initiate crown fire. If our surface fire that we have has more intensity than that, we can expect crown fire. So the crown base height is really just that vertical distance from the ground to the bottom of the live crown. And you can see on the right-hand side that, that we don't want to get trapped. Crowding will occur at that weakest link. So this table at the top is derived using Van Wagner's formula, and there was a little subnote there on the previous slide that did come from Van Wagner's critical surface intensity work. So this table is embedded in the critical surface intensity worksheet that is available on the Tools for Fuel Management webpage, and I'll show the link in a little bit. So what I want to do is kind of just point out a couple things. So in the fire behavior predictive system, 97% moisture content is a constant. So in the table, we've highlighted 95%, just because it's close to that 97. So if we use an example of a stand that was treated to 3 meters in height, so if I come down to 3 and I look at that 95% moisture content, what this is telling me is the critical surface intensity to initiate crown fire is 824 kilowatts per meter. So I've got that information that I can use. Now, if I look at the bottom part, we can calculate or estimate intensity from observed fire behavior. So it's an estimation for surface fires only, and we can use this formula where I, the intensity is again in kilowatts per meter, is equal to the flame length squared. So if we're observing, and you can see there is a difference between flame height and flame length, if we happen to be observing a 2 meter flame length on the fire that we have, and we run it through the formula, so we've got 2 meters, we can square it, which is 4, multiply it by 300, we're generating, or we're seeing a fire that's generating approximately 1200 kilowatts per meter of intensity. So we can come back and we can compare that to our critical surface intensity and say, okay, 1200 is in excess of 824. We should expect crown fire initiation. So we can also predict surface fire intensity using Byram's equation, where it's basically saying intensity equals the heat of combustion times the weight of the fuel multiplied by the rate of spread. And we've had some much smarter people than me that have done some work and come up with what those numbers actually look like. So I equals 300 times that weight of the fuel times the rate of spread. And this formula is also embedded into that same spreadsheet on the Tools for Fuel Management website. So basically what you're seeing here is for that area on the left-hand side that is that 1.5 kilograms per square meter. Again, it's just for those fine fuels. I've used that as an input. That previous slide that I showed a little while back that I think the spread rate was 3.3 meters per minute, I just rounded it off to 3. So if we have 3 meters a minute, times that weight of the fuel times 300, this is what generates our intensity. So we're seeing a fire for that amount of fuel and that spread rate of around 1350 kilowatts per meter. Now keep in mind, it's for those fine fuels. If we were to add some of those bigger fuels in the duff, I would hazard to guess that we're probably close to double that, which would double our intensity. So we're up and around 2,700, 3,000. So we're more intensity than what we're looking for in those targets and those fire behavior outcomes. So if you have this information, if you know what your surface fuel loading is, and we've got those 90th percentile conditions, we can run it through these tables, and then we can compare it to our critical surface intensity and that 2,000 kilowatts per meter target. So let's do that. So again, using our 3 meter crown base height from that previous pruning example that gave us an intensity or critical surface intensity of 824. Based on that 1350, just for the fine fuels that we did in the previous slide, we can see we're above. Again, we should expect crown fire initiation to occur. So I've played with this a little bit, just in those tables down below. And because we weren't quite at 90th percentile conditions. So if I bump it up a little bit and go with a rate of spread of 5 meters per minute, and because I want to burn this and I feel I can get that fuel loading down to 0.5 kilogram per square meter, when I run it through the same formula, you can see that now my intensity is 750. So in this case, not only am I below the critical surface intensity, I'm also below the 2,000 kilowatts per meter. So the science shows us that we need to either lift the crown base height or reduce the surface fuel loading, or both. So if I look at the photo on the left, because in that treatment, we've retained trees with a crown base height of larger or higher than 5 meters, based on those calculations in the bottom, you can see I'm significantly below critical surface intensity. So for 5 meters, the critical surface intensity is almost 1,800 kilowatts per meter. If I can get that stand down to 0.5 kilogram of fuel, then you can see again, I'm only at 750. Let's say I can't get it quite down to 0.5 kilogram or 5 tons and can only get it down to 7 tons or a 0.7. What generates out of it is just over 1,000 kilowatts per meter for intensity. Again, I'm still well below the 1,700 for critical surface intensity to initiate crowning, and I'm still well below that 2,000 target. So you can see that there are some tools there that'll help us with the intensity. So this is just a summary of the treatment and effect. It's based on the G and Hesberg's work. And the surface fuel reduction, we already discussed as well that it does impact spotting. I think what I want to say is that an open stand isn't necessarily the wrong approach. It's just the trade-offs need to be understood. More sunlight to the forest floor increases the establishment of those flashy fuels. It'll likely increase the need for maintenance. It'll increase the forest floor temperature, potentially the in-stand winds, and lower the relative humidity. So just knowing what those trade-offs are and understanding that that might be a more appropriate treatment beyond that initial 100 meters. So Kelly has a few contracts in place to evaluate fuel treatment efficacy, but I think in the meantime, we need to approach this, that the ultimate test of a fuel treatment is if and when the fire comes, and we all want to see that treatment pass the test. The reality is that in many places, effective fuel treatments in the WUI are going to be labor intensive, and they're going to be expensive to deal with the effect of decades of fuel buildup. So we have the funding to do some of that work now. We need to use the tools to ensure the treatments are occurring in the right locations. if we design and implement those treatments using these tools and using fire behavior targets, the maintenance of these areas should be relatively quite cheap and easy in 7, 10, or 12 years when we might not have the funding.
So Rory, it is 10 a.m. and it would be great to have some question time. Is it possible to sort of wrap up the next slides in maybe 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, you bet. I'll shoot to get them done. It might be closer to 5, but we'll definitely we'll sneak through them.
Okay, for sure.
So I was asked to just kind of speak a little bit about prescribed fire as a field treatment, and we need to be looking more at it in these types of field treatments, both as part of the initial treatment and as a maintenance treatment where it's ecologically appropriate. So where prescribed fire is being considered, we just need to make sure we're including it within the prescription. We're covering it off in the referral and consultation process, so we don't necessarily have to do it at the burn plan stage then. And we want to make sure we get some of the objectives and the fire effects in there. And like any other disturbance on a land base, it needs to be well and appropriately planned. It's an activity that, although unintended, can have significant negative consequences. But it is going to be a key activity to reduce wildfire risk in communities, and it's going to be a high priority for BC Wildfire Service to work with proponents on that planning and implementation. So I'm just going to show a couple things just to make things conducive to prescribed fire. With this one, again, there's going to be a little bit of work just removing some fuel away from the base of the tree, so we're just not creating too much damage. Designing fuel treatments, again, there's control line on this side. There's also one under this helicopter skid, so it makes it a little more conducive to prescribed fire as it's got a bit of a box around it. The photo on the right-hand side where I've drawn in that black line, that'd be a good opportunity just to consider some mineral soil disturbance. Doesn't need to be bladed, could be skidded along there and then out to the road just to create some disturbance, just to make it conducive to prescribed fire as a treatment. Spruce stands, I know that folks wanted a little bit of information on some other treatments. Spruce stands can be tricky. They have notorious for wind throw. They're thin bark, so maybe prescribed fire isn't always the best treatment. This photo on the right was a wildfire. Light intensity fire might be appropriate, but I know spruce stands can be challenging, especially when we get into those dense C2 type of stands. So we don't know all the answers for those. And I'm going to kind of quickly, I think, just run through just some references because I want to have some time here for questions. And then just some acknowledgement to some folks out there. Dana Hicks has been a key person in developing some of the tools that are out there. And just thanks to Kate and Jim and Julie for helping set this up. And these are the key players that are involved with making fuel management happen out on the land base. So I think I'll close it there. There was a few other slides that it would have been nice to spend a bit of time talking about, but I think it makes sense to leave some time for questions.
Great, yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for that great presentation. We do have some questions that have come in, so I'll just read it out and you guys can decide who's the best to answer it. So in a couple of slides, you spoke about the fire managed ecosystems for resiliency. And this questioner is wondering whether the province is integrating this approach versus the Smokey the Bear approach that's been applied for decades.
I mean, I think absolutely. This is Kelly here. We certainly recommendations from the Abbott Chapman report were relatively clear in that in understanding and advancing the role of fire in our fire maintained or fire dependent forests. So absolutely, the province is shifting, and Roy's working hard on some prescribed fire groups with that. But it's going to take time. It's a kind of a Titanic to turn around. I don't know if Roy has any.
Yeah, you know, it is a good question. It is a culture shift, and I've seen, and I think it's interesting seeing the change or that shift taking place, and it's happening in different parts of the province. And what I've noticed is, especially since the 2017 wildfires, that that in some places that experience that, there's an understanding that we need to be doing things different. And kind of, I think, looking at that culture shift. But I think, like Kelly said, it is going to take time, and we have to be proactive with the messaging. But yeah, it's encouraging to see that shift, that mindset changing in some places.
Great, yeah, thank you. So the next question is, what is being done to address the fact that the FBP system and associated fuel types were developed for boreal ecosystems, but these only represent a portion of the diversity of forest types in BC? And the second part of the question, how do we address the diversity of forest types, including pine leading stands impacted by mountain pine beetle, that are not appropriately represented by any of the fuel types currently available?
Well, I know Kelly doesn't want that question. It is a good question. There are obviously some limitations with, with a limited number of benchmark fuel types, and it's not an easy answer. There is some fuel typing work being done with the Canadian Forest Service just to kind of look at mountain pine beetle impacts or fuel typing post-fire and time since fire. And trying to find the best representation of it. And they aren't always the best fit. There is some work that's being done in the background. I think, we're a little ways away from seeing some results. But yeah, it is a limitation. And then, I was careful to note that, this using some of those fuel types as we use some of those formulas as well. It's an approximation. It gives us a bit of an idea of what the potential is, but it's not going to be a perfect science by any means. And I'm not sure, what was the second part of the question again?
So the second part, how do we address the diversity of forest types, including the pine leading stand impacted by mountain pine beetle, that are not appropriately represented by any fuel types currently available?
Yeah, I know I spoke to the pine beetle just kind of briefly there. It is a tricky one. Like I say, I know there's a bit of work being done working with the CFS on the fuel typing, but I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but we can look into some follow-up on what actually is being done and looked at out there to kind of look at that gap.
Yeah, definitely. Great. So the next question, and Karen, please feel free to clarify if I'm not getting this correct. How do you calculate the probability of a fire in the risk assessment, given that there's been a lot of variability and changes in climate and fuel over the last 100 years?
It's Kelly here. So our current PSTA doesn't actually provide a probability. It provides a relative risk assessment. So each sort of site or pixel is at a higher relative level of a potential future fire, and it incorporates fire history, as well as the most recent fuel typing map of which Dana Hicks and Dan Pracus, those folks do look at some of those square peg round hole challenges that were discussed earlier in building that provincial map. And obviously with climate change, we're looking at the new PSA that's coming out in 2019. I seem to recall, don't quote me on this, but we're only looking back 25 years of the weather station data. So it's starting to incorporate. I know Laurie Daniels did some research on some of our weather station data to look at if there was any statistical changes in the amount of high danger, high fire weather indice days in the last 25 years versus the previous, and there is inside that data. So when you go back to kind of that 25 or 30 years as a chunk of weather, those trends are starting to be incorporated. So as we move forward, we'll be more sophisticated with that, but in terms of a downscaling climate change and having a forecasted fuel typing map, we're not quite there. We're certainly looking at and want to work with universities and researchers on how to go there, but there's a lot of embedded assumptions within that, as well as is the event going to happen over time in terms of a vegetation change, or is it going to be a radical disturbance, and how do you model that? So there's certainly a lot more questions, but we're improving as much as we can every day.
Great. So there's one question, and it looks like we have time for maybe 2 to 3 more questions. And I know that there's more questions than that that are currently in the queue. So we'll see about following up with potentially answering these questions after the webinar. So thank you everyone for submitting your questions. So the next one is, I'm working on a fuel management project with a local government. Because of archaeology and open burning smoke control regulations around the community, we cannot burn our debris piles. We will be chipping all of our materials on site. Can you please address acceptable wood chip depth that could be dispersed within the treated area, and maybe scenarios that other communities are doing when they are unable to burn their debris piles?
It's Kelly here. I mean, I'll turn it over to Rory on the difficult to do a site-specific prescription sort of over the phone, but I do want to kind of address a bit of the part of the Smoky Bear question that was earlier. Is we do really want to try and work with those local governments. If it's a local burning bylaw, I think that, you know, having some more broad conversations with communities about the potential sort of conflict between having an efficient fuel treatment achieved and an individual burning bylaw. I do think some of those conversations, we need to shift those forward, and I can turn to Rory in terms of chipping. There's challenges with the efficacy and the depth and residual risk, Rory, but I think we got to start working with our communities where they have those local burning bylaws.
Yeah, the chipping one's a good question, and I know there is a bit of research out there, and I don't have some of it at my fingertips. And I know that you know, you asked about depth, and I think we have a pretty good understanding that we don't want to see, you know, really deep accumulations, you know, jackpotted under trees, and you know, some of those answers are, I think, fairly obvious. In terms of a depth, it's a tough one, and I don't have that at the top of my head. I would probably need to do a bit of research myself, because I think once you're starting to, you know, approach 10 centimeters or so, you're still having fine fuels on the site. You know, it does hold a bit of moisture in and those kind of things, and it can suppress some of that flashy fuel growth. But at the same time too, it's still a fine fuel that under certain conditions, it's still going to be available to burn. So it's a bit of a tricky one. I think the ecosystem that you're in makes a difference as well in terms of how much moisture is in that area. So I think there's a bunch of factors that have to be thought of to kind of really truly answer that question. Kelly mentioned the obscure, the smoke control regulation. You know, it is something that we've been working quite closely with Ministry of Environment on, to look at just look at some flexibility for related to WUI fuel treatments, and that's something that I think we can expect to see some changes. You know, the next time that gets read and approached. So we are working on that. Doesn't mean that there shouldn't be alternatives to deal with the biomass, but we are addressing that for WUI fuel treatments.
Thank you. So the next one, what size of surface fuels are you measuring in your loading calculations?
So in the example that I showed, I just showed you the results of the less than 7 centimeters, but we're measuring, you know, with use the line transects, and Kelly flashed up just some of the tools of inventorying woody material, and those are available on that Tools for Fuel Management website, and it shows you how to do that. We're measuring all fuels using that line transect method. What I showed you is just the results of the less than 7 centimeters, but we're measuring them all.
Great, thank you. So last question. This one's about the need for maintenance for fuel breaks. How does this need for maintenance factor into prescriptions?
Good question. You know, at the very least, we have to have some forethought about it when we're developing the prescriptions. And I know, having quite a bit of conversation with some of the wildfire prevention officers who are working, you know, they're the ones working with the consultants and prescribing foresters on it. Yeah, it's one of those things, especially with prescribed fire, or it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's prescribed fire or not, is putting our minds to what the maintenance is going to be. And we're not always going to nail it to the exact year, but I think getting a bit of an idea on time frame of, you know, if it's 7 years since treatment, that we expect that we at least need to monitor and have a look at it. And just, I think, identifying in that section of the prescription that, you know, maintenance is going to need to be considered from approximately this year to this year. And if prescribed fire is being considered, that it gets identified in that prescription at that stage. It just gives us that much more flexibility to use prescribed fire as a maintenance treatment if it's gone through that referral process and consultation with the rest of the prescription.
Perfect. Well, that's perfectly on time. Thank you so much, Kelly and Rory, for joining us and giving this webinar presentation today. And also thank you for everyone for joining and asking questions and yeah, joining us this morning for this webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.